Senator Hanson.
Thank you very much. I rise to bring to the attention of senators and the people of Australia, yet again, the inequality that exists in the funding of Indigenous programs and the continuing desperate circumstances of the victims of this financial bastardry and mismanagement. I learned of this in my many conversations over the years with Indigenous communities across Australia. Unlike many vocal urban Aboriginal elites, I have walked through the streets of remote Aboriginal communities in Queensland, the Northern Territory, South Australia and Western Australia, and I've listened and I understand. Whether it's sitting on the beach with Malawop on Thursday Island or Jimpana and her family at the base of Uluru, just being in remote communities listening to elders and residents have been profound and very informative. There's not one Indigenous community I've met with that isn't concerned and they want to share what's going wrong. A lot of these people can't even gain access to their own land, which has in many cases been given back to the registered native title bodies, corporate, which are often more restrictive than the government was. Many of these bodies, especially in more remote areas, are highly restrictive to the detriment of the Aboriginal people. Some are charged to go on their ancestral land, or worse still, some are denied access altogether. But those conversations in both the large communities and in remote locations always turn to the needs that their isolation and situation brings. Needs reflected in a lack of adequate housing, a deficiency of infrastructure, widespread alcoholism, out-of-control levels of domestic violence, repeated sexual abuse, including of young children, and a lack of effective pathways to escape the cycles of poverty and unemployment that are often normalised and passed on from generation to generation. Those communities live on the other side of what the highly respected Indigenous spokesperson Jacinta Price referred to in the Australian newspaper recently as a chasm. She described in detail how the Aboriginal elite, the activists, the academics from the indoctrination centres posing as the universities, those with their hands out for grant money, those with the loudest voices who want to change the date of Australia Day, they all live in the city on their side of the chasm. When was the last time you heard one of the members of the elite in this place saying anything positive or uplifting about Indigenous achievements? When was the last time you heard one of the activists who identifies as Indigenous talk up the efforts of those in remote locations working to succeed? The elites, the truth deniers, they know there's a multitude of ways to end the misery. They know there's a ton of money being poured into programs. When they call for an Indigenous voice in the Parliament, they deliberately don't remind you there are multiple Indigenous voices already here. In fact, the percentage of those identifying as Indigenous in this place is greater than the percentage in the national population. And why won't we hear stories of achievement, of encouragement, of empowerment, of Indigenous role models and success stories? Why won't you hear them remind their people of Neville Bonner, who came from a little island in the Tweed River to become the first Aboriginal to sit in the Commonwealth Parliament and who, as Senator Bonner, went on to be re-elected in 4 subsequent elections? He was also proud to accept Australian of the Year in 1979. He's a standout role model for young Indigenous people and their parents. But his story isn't used by the Aboriginal elites because this hero of his people doesn't fit their political agenda. Mick Dodson, Aboriginal and Professor of Law, who also accepted the Australian of the Year award in 2009, summed up the widespread Indigenous success the elites and their mates don't want you to hear when he told the Sun Herald in 2010, and I quote, "It's become unexceptional to have successful Indigenous filmmakers, artists, doctors, academics, lawyers, nurses and politicians," end quote. As a nation, we love to celebrate the achievements of all Australians. We're that kind of society, and we love, as a nation, to cheer the underdogs. We cheer, we celebrate, and so many of our kids try to be like their heroes, the battlers, the ones who give it a real go, as well as the ones who succeed. That's the real Aussie, and it's not based on the colour of your skin. They want to rewrite history. They've made it in their mission in life to reframe Australia, both its history and the present. They spray their venom, they hiss their threats and slurs, they denigrate our great nation and all it stands for. They work hard to to intoxicate our youth with their lies and to divide our country. And the division isn't between black and white, it's between black and everyone else. So many of them seem to have made it their life's work to enjoy the substantial salary and profile of their city-based positions while they work to ensure Indigenous communities remain trapped in permanent victimhood.
Order, Senator Hanson.
Acting Deputy President, a senator in this chamber was shouting abuse at a senator while they were on their feet, and I'd ask you to call that senator to order, please.
I just remind every senator that they should only speak from the place in the chamber, and any disorderly conduct is not appreciated. Yes, Senator Thorpe.
Point of order.
Is there a point of order? Yep.
I'm finding it quite offensive in my workplace to hear the senator from Queensland speak the language that she's speaking. I find it offensive and I find it divisive, and I ask the Senator of Queensland to retract from any more attacks on Aboriginal people in this country.
Senator Thorpe, I do understand what you're saying, but what you're raising is a point of debate and not a point of procedure. So if you could address those when you have an opportunity to speak. Senator Hanson.
So many of them seem to have made it their life's work to enjoy the substantial salary and profile of their city-based positions while they work to ensure Indigenous communities remain trapped in permanent victimhood, because without victims to point to, the elites of the city side of the chasm have no relevance. As Henry Ergus said in The Australian recently, by the city-based mob, their aim is to incite, not to inform. Ergus also pointed out, and I quote, "The whole sorry culture perpetuates a sense of victimhood that gives European settlement no credit to the enormous gains it has conferred. The Aboriginal elite are creating and tolerating a permanent victimhood for their Indigenous Australian brothers and sisters, and they don't care. They'll let the Indigenous population pay any price to achieve their goals. Their idea of equality is we own everything and the rest get nothing. They want 100% of the land. For them, the 32% of Australia under native title already isn't enough. It does not include private Indigenous land ownership. They want 100% of Australia to be owned by around 3% of the population based on the colour of their skin or their ancestry. That's called racism. Pure and simple racism, and it needs to be called out and exposed at every opportunity.
Order. Senator Thorpe, is there a point of order?
Yes, there is a point of order, Deputy Acting President. There's a lot of untruths being said in the Senator for Queensland's statement, and I understand that it's coming to 5:30 and we don't have time to debate. So as long as I'm sitting here in my workplace hearing lies from the Senator from Queensland, who obviously has an issue with black people in this country, aren't I able to feel safe in my workplace?
Your seat. And as I said earlier, I completely understand what you're saying, but that is a debating point. So we'll move back to... Sorry, Senator Ruston, did you have anything to say? We will move back to Senator Hanson.
It's common knowledge that billions of dollars thrown at Indigenous programs far exceed the funds put into non-Indigenous programs on a per capita basis. Non-Indigenous government spending per capita is $22,000 versus $45,000 for Indigenous Australians. Tens of billions of dollars are spent each year on programs to assist Aboriginal communities, both remote and major.
Order.
From Jacinta Price's policy paper, Worlds Apart, published in January this year by the Centre for Independent Studies, we learned the Productivity Commission estimates that government spent around $33.4 billion on Indigenous peoples in 2015-16. One standout of those figures is that around $4.1 billion of that was spent on public order and safety alone. That's $6,300 per person. That's 10 times the amount spent on the typical Australian. What I will say here, isn't it a coincidence that from 1971 to 2016, the year of the last official consensus, the population of Aboriginal Australians increased by 459% during the rollout of these programs, while the general population increased by only 83.5%. This is, the people of Australia know it's way overdue for those on the left and the right to accept that the awful plight of so many Indigenous communities runs across party lines and the system is being rorted. Indigenous families, any family, should never be political pawns. The hollow cries of hate speech thrown across this chamber to deflect from the truth are badges of honour I and my party wear with pride. One Nation will continue to shine a light on the rorts, the injustice, the inequality and discrimination. The shameful
Senator Hanson,
silence.
your time has expired.
Pauline Hanson's speech in the Senate has once again reignited one of Australia's most controversial debates: the effectiveness of Indigenous programs, government spending, and the gap between policymakers and people living in remote communities. Throughout her address, Hanson argued that despite billions of dollars being allocated to Indigenous-focused programs over many decades, many remote communities continue to face serious social and economic challenges. She pointed to issues such as housing shortages, unemployment, domestic violence, substance abuse, inadequate infrastructure, and limited opportunities for young people. Her central argument was that governments of all political persuasions have spent enormous amounts of money without delivering the outcomes many Indigenous Australians deserve. A major theme of Hanson's speech was the distinction she drew between Indigenous leaders and activists based in major cities and Indigenous Australians living in remote communities. She claimed there is a growing disconnect between those who influence policy discussions and those who experience the day-to-day realities on the ground. According to Hanson, many conversations about Indigenous affairs focus heavily on symbolism and political campaigns, while practical issues affecting families and communities receive less attention. The senator also questioned whether existing Indigenous organizations and representative bodies are achieving their intended purpose. She argued that accountability and transparency should be central to any government-funded program, particularly when taxpayers' money is involved. Hanson suggested Australians deserve to know where funding is being spent and whether measurable improvements are being achieved in education, health, employment, housing, and community safety. Another significant point raised during the speech was the importance of recognizing positive Indigenous success stories. Hanson highlighted examples of Indigenous Australians who have achieved success in public life, business, education, the arts, and politics. Her argument was that highlighting achievement and opportunity can inspire younger generations and encourage greater participation in education, employment, and leadership roles. Not surprisingly, several of Hanson's comments sparked strong reactions within the Senate chamber. Critics accused her of making divisive statements and argued that her characterization of Indigenous organizations and activists was unfair. Supporters, however, would likely argue that Hanson is raising questions that many Australians believe deserve open discussion, particularly regarding government expenditure and policy outcomes. The exchange demonstrates just how sensitive and complex Indigenous policy remains in Australia. While there is broad agreement across the political spectrum that Indigenous Australians should have access to better opportunities, safer communities, and improved living standards, there remains considerable disagreement about how those goals should be achieved. Some believe greater Indigenous representation and self-determination are essential to closing long-standing gaps in health, education, and economic outcomes. Others argue that existing structures require significant reform and that funding should be more closely linked to measurable results and accountability. What is clear is that these issues are unlikely to disappear from Australia's political agenda anytime soon. Questions surrounding government spending, community outcomes, representation, accountability, and Indigenous empowerment continue to generate passionate debate both inside Parliament and across the broader Australian community. Ultimately, Hanson's speech was not simply about funding figures or political disagreements. It was about competing visions for how Australia addresses some of its most difficult social challenges. Whether one agrees with her conclusions or not, the discussion highlights the ongoing need for practical solutions that improve lives, strengthen communities, and create opportunities for future generations across both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia.